My God, look what they've sent me. No, that's not a lament from Sky Cricket's podcast listeners, as myself and Nas pop up to talk more drivel about cricket. But it was a captain, England captain, Archie McLaren in 1902, who complained about the team that the selectors had given him before the 1902 Ashes Test match. So today's podcast is all about selection, really, on the back of some very interesting selections, both for the next Test match team and then for the ODI and T20 squads to take on Australia at the end of the year. Nasser, how are you? Before we talk about selection, we might just touch on the Test match from Old Trafford. How are you?
Yeah, good. Always better to have come back down south. The sun is shining. We've got a bit of warmth. It's not raining. The forecast is excellent for the next 2 weeks, actually. Both the two London Test matches ahead against Sri Lanka, Lords, and then the Oval. Enjoyable 4 days in the end, wasn't it? I thought it was a really good Test match. It was an unusual Old Trafford pitch. It wasn't as quick and bouncy. And Sri Lanka, apart from that third morning, put on a really good show, but they'll be very disappointed with that third morning. I think it cost them the game. They pushed England hard, but the whole point of Test match cricket, you have one bad session and you're up against it, especially away from home. You're not allowed, you can't have one bad session. And they did, and it cost them. And you, happy to be back down south?
Well, I enjoyed my time up north, as you know, my hometown. I thought it was looking splendid. Put on an excellent Test match, as it always does. But I enjoyed the Test. I thought it was competitive. I mean, classically, when you get scores of around that 250 to 320 mark, you're usually in for a pretty tight and competitive Test match, and that's how it turned out to be. I agree with you. I thought Sri Lanka had that one bad session, which was costly, but I thought I saw enough from the batters, particularly. I mean, I thought Kamindu Mendis's 100 was one of the better hundreds that we've seen from an overseas batsman in recent years in England. And if they get the top order firing, there's enough there in that top seven to think that they might get a few runs, particularly with England's attack just creaking a little bit. And we'll come on to that in a minute. But they've certainly got enough to get runs. I think they need a bit more support for Asitha Fernando with the ball. Prabhat Jayasuriya did okay, the spinner. I thought Vishwa Fernando was a bit disappointing. But if they can get a bit more from their bowlers, and you probably expect them to come on for the run, then I think they can be competitive at Lords and the Oval.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I was so impressed with Kamindu Mendis. I mean, it's the first time I've seen him live, and he's had a very good start to Test match cricket. But sometimes you think, is that playing at home? Is that playing in Bangladesh where he got a lot of runs? When actually, it's just that he looks a very good player. I think he'll have to work at, and Broady Stewart was talking about it a lot, was round the wicket to him, and he got out both times round the wicket. And England didn't go to him quickly round the wicket because since Broad has retired and a few injuries, they don't have this particular seam attack, don't like going round the wicket, the likes of Wokes and Potts in particular. But it was noticeable in the end. They got him out both innings round the wicket. So that's one thing he'll have to work on for Lords. But it was an enjoyable Test match. And in the end, Root just showed his class, didn't he? Just an old-fashioned innings where he just sort of said, I'm going to be here at the end. We're missing a couple of batters in Crawley and Stokes, and we can't risk it with our tail. I'm just going to be here at the end. And he absolutely showed his class at a ground that he loves batting at.
It was a bit reminiscent of the first game under Stokes and McCullum, actually, a tight, tense run chase, all the Bazballing batting that came afterwards. Don't forget that first game where Root, scored that 100 under pressure, chasing, very important innings that got Bazball off to a winning start. And that was similar kind of innings at Old Trafford. What did you make of Ollie Pope? Did you look out onto the field and think there is an England captain in the making?
Yeah, listen, there was only one period, and it was in that partnership where just before they changed the ball and they looked like they just lost ideas, and you saw senior bowlers like Wokes sort of waving his arms around and setting his own field, and there was a little bit of captaincy by committee at that stage because they were searching for a wicket. But apart from that 1 hour, maybe you looked down on the field and you thought Ollie Pope's in charge of this side. His presence, his body language, and his decision-making was pretty good. Best decision he made was changing that ball and getting a newer one and getting it swinging. So that's how they got their wickets in the end, second time round. His biggest thing is going to be batting and captaining. Batting at 3, as it is with the bat. He's had some ups and downs already. Averages 34, 35. So the big question is that the captaincy cannot impact your batting. Generally, with England captains, what it does is impacts it in the right direction. You're sort of so inspired and so safe in your position, and you want to lead from the front. Your batting stats or your all-rounder stats with Stokes may go in that direction. But then as the job weighs you down, it starts to affect your game. With most captains, not all. I'm talking about England captains here. So he did fine, but he's a standing captain. Make no mistake of that. His biggest thing was he's won the game. For all this thing of talk about the future and winning in Australia, just win the game in front of you. Played 1-1-1 as captain. He'll take that. But his job is to turn up at Lords and get runs. That, for me, is more important than what he looks like as a captain.
So I mentioned Archie McLaren, that barb that he threw at the England selectors in 1902. Now, I know you look old enough to have known Archie McLaren, but it was a bit before your time. But selection's been very interesting, hasn't it? I mean, immediately on the back of that Test match, because Mark Wood pulled his thigh, they had to bring in an extra bowler. Obviously, it looks like Ollie Stone will play in the 11. But the man they've brought into the squad, Josh Hull, has come from nowhere, really. I mean, it's a remarkable selection. Maybe we might dive into that a bit more deeply. First of all, what do we know about him? He's very young, 6'7", left arm, a farmer's son of a farmer from the Midlands. Not played very much cricket at all, but they've had their eye on him. I did that Metro Bank one-day final last year when he bowled pretty well at the end of that game. And he's got some attributes that they like, not notably his height, the left arm angle, and the potential to get a bit quicker. He's not quite quick yet, but the potential is there. But his numbers are extraordinary. It's a real selection along the Shoaib Bashir lines and Rayan Ahmed lines. I think his first class average at the moment is 62. That's with the ball, not with the bat, by the way. And, in championship cricket for Leicestershire, probably up in the 80s. So numbers are one thing, but they've seen something they like. They see some potential there.
I think, isn't his first class average this season 180? I think that's with a couple of kookaburra balls at the start of the season. I think it's an incredible story, really. It comes from Old Stamford School, our old mate, Dean Headley. Dean Headley will be absolutely thrilled today because we'll come on to the one-day selection, white ball selection. He's made all 3 camps, Josh Hull. He's in 50 over, 20 over, and a Lord's Test match this week. And I think Dino sort of saw him at Stamford and got in contact with Phil De Freitas at Leicestershire, who was coach then. And that's how he got that contract. It is very much this present regime. There's a sort of complete disconnect from county cricket stats to what they want. The only stat they seemed interested in is pace and potential pace. In Hull's case, as you say, he could get quicker, and it gets us all rushing. I remember driving to Sky to do the very first award-winning Sky Cricket podcast, and as we were driving, the phone was ringing saying they've selected Bashir. And I had to stop off and started sort of tweeting and put into the search Bashir to see those wickets that he got. It was like, you may have seen, because you're Josh, would have played against some of these lads, but
he was on the Lions camp with him actually last November. So I had a head start on you there.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm rushing to see wickets from Hull, and he looks quick enough. He swings it. All I've seen is stumps flying everywhere in white ball cricket. So he's got that sort of what they're looking for. So I like it. I like this. Rob Keane came on our podcast, and he said in the media, all he's interested this summer, the only stats he's interested in is what pace. Don't worry about wickets. What speed are you bowling? So they're staying true to their world. They're left field selections, and they're all one thing we can't argue after. There's some things we can pick with the present regime, but what they have done well. Look at Jamie Smith this week again. What they have done well is that everyone they've selected, pretty much bar none, have come in and done well. And you've gone, whoa, that's why they've selected him. So I'm hoping Josh Hull continues that trend. The only thing I would think of sometimes, and Key and the others won't be bothered about it, is the lads that will be sitting in county cricket and thinking, well, what about me? Sam, for those stats you give there, Sam Cooke has nearly got 300 first-class wickets at 19 in his career. And he'll be sitting there. Now, whether he's not quite ready, fit enough, he played one championship game since his recent injuries with Essex, or whether they just don't think he's quick enough. There's no point moving away from Anderson if you go for someone of a similar pace.
I also think it's flipped a bit. In the past, certainly when we played and for decades before, selection for the Test team or the England men's team in one-day cricket or Test cricket was kind of your performances in county cricket. That was a reward, wasn't it, for your performances in county cricket? If you burst on the scene, took things by storm, you could get. We both got picked at 21. It's not as though they've not picked players early before, but they were generally on the back of some pretty decent performances in county cricket. And then you had the odd kind of lifetime achievement award, somebody who really performed over a long period of time and was given a cap on the back of that long and consistent performances in county cricket. Whereas now it's flipped, it seems to me, a little bit. And maybe we'll talk about this, partly the consequence of the way county cricket has changed, early season, late season conditions, lack of overseas fast bowlers. But it's flipped a bit. So instead of looking at performances in county cricket and saying, right, the best performances in county cricket make up the England team, let's see how they go, and you throw them all together. They're actually saying, well, what does the Test team need? What are the conditions demand, whether it's Pakistan and three spinners or Australia and fast bowlers? And let's work back from that and let's go to county cricket and find the kind of individual and the kind of player that we think will fit what we need. And it doesn't really matter about the performances that they've put in, because what we've seen will back our judgment, and then we'll take that and fit it into the team. And you certainly can't argue with the results, as you say.
No, you can't. I mean, it does leave people hanging at times, because obviously, like, you go back each of those tours, and as you were saying there, I was thinking that's exactly what they've done, haven't they? They went to Pakistan, realizing they need a third spinner, probably a wrist spinner. They went Rayan Ahmed, does well, gets 5 for on debut, but then you don't see him since. They then go to India and they realize they need high release points. So they get Bashir, but they also get Tom Hartley, and then you don't see him again. So they have these selections that are very much horses for courses. And I think you're right. They absolutely, now they're looking ahead to Australia. I mean, Pakistan first, obviously New Zealand, but the winter after, Australia and the Ashes, and they realizing they need tall, quick. They don't need medium dobbers. So you're absolutely right. They're working backwards from what they need. We used to go into selection meetings, and the only thing we had, apart from maybe a glass of red on the table, was first class averages. So you'd have the first class average. And I reckon the first sign that we did different for my era as captain, you can tell me differently, but there's 2 things we did differently. One was we had a definite policy to move away from stats to pick on character. So we had all these people that were absolutely bossing it in county cricket, but we really wanted to know what they were like under pressure. So almost weighted statistics, like they ended up having for a while. Where were they getting their runs? When? What was the score? Who against? Were they just getting tail end wickets? But also, what was their character like? And the second was similar to what's happening now. Duncan, there would be a number of bowlers, Martin Bicknell would be one of them, who was getting wickets for fun week after week. But Duncan would go, what speed is he? And in those days, it was a bit of guesswork. Nowadays, there's all the all the stuff that you can use. They've got so much information. But in our day, it used to be a bit of guesswork. Is he quick enough? Duncan used to ask.
Is there a danger? I'm thinking about the player himself, actually. I wrote about it yesterday in the paper, and I was reading one of the comments from one of our readers who must be a Leicestershire fan, or at least had watched Leicestershire and Josh Hull a couple of times this year. It wasn't a very complimentary post about Josh Hull. I won't repeat it, but it finished by saying, it's too soon. This could harm him. And that was the reader saying that. I'm not saying that. But is there a danger that a player can be picked too soon before they're ready, and that could set them back? Or is it a case of McCullum and Stokes saying, we're getting him out of a different environment into our environment, and we'll back ourselves to turn this, the potential that we've seen, will back our man management skills and our coaching skills to turn that potential into the end product?
I think there is a danger of that, but it really depends on the environment that he's going into. And anyone that we speak to has had success that goes into that environment, often talks about how we've been in there, we've been in that team room. Occasionally we're invited in, and you can see that sort of calmness and that backing that they all get. They're not just picked on a sort of, you don't feel like, or they're having a look at me. They actually make you believe you're a huge part of their future. I'm thinking of examples. James Bracey was one, wasn't he, that was picked. And then I think it did harm him. He's spoken about it for a while after that. He had a bad couple of games, and it said it really, in fact, impacted his cricket and his mental health, that he wasn't ready for all of us pundits analyzing his keeping and his batting, and he got some low scores, and one affected the other, and it affected him. So you'd think and you'd hope in this environment that, because they're so stubborn, and I use this word with this regime, I like them being stubborn, that if they do pick you, I'd be very surprised if you end up a one-test wonder, as we had many in our era.
The majority of the left field selections that we've touched on there have all been bowlers. So you mentioned Josh Tong, you mentioned Rayan Ahmed, you mentioned Tom Hartley, and we're talking about Josh Hull. It looks like, because of when the championship is played and often the different conditions of Duke's balls and maybe early and late season conditions, they're saying that what is required for the championship is very different from what might be required for Test cricket, where particularly pace that they're looking at and spin. What about batters? I mean, again, the conditions can be different, but the fewer left field selections, aren't there, with batters? Do you think batters still have to show in championship cricket, in county cricket, that you've got to get runs on the board to get picked?
Well, I guess with batting, you have to, if you're only averaging 10, I'm trying to work out the equivalent of
Yes.
who's averaging
Averaging
180
2 in the championship.
If you're averaging 2, the selectors can't actually make a judgment on you. So you have to be in the middle long enough for them to go, well, he'll be good in Test match cricket. It used to happen. 2 of our finest ever were picked on mediocre first-class averages, Trescothick and Vaughan.
Yeah.
The average Vaughan was 30 odd, Trez was 30 odd. I remember ringing up a couple of Yorkies and saying, what about this lad Vaughan? Every time I play against him, he looks really good. And they'd say, yeah, he looks really good, but he keeps getting out in the 30s and 40s. Same with Trez.
That's
Trez was
early in his day.
Yeah, exactly. But, yeah, I'm not saying who that's harsh on, actually, but Trez was batting in the middle order, and then he got that brilliant 150 or 200 against Glamorgan when Duncan was watching. So there have been times where people with average, mediocre, first-class stats come in. And because it is a different game, isn't it? In general, like even Gucci or whatever, if you bowl to Gooch above the waist, it's a game above the waist a bit more, Test match cricket. As Graham Thorpe used to say, you have to have a back foot game to play Test match cricket. Whereas first-class cricket, it is a little bit more a front foot game. Ball, they're targeting that front pad of yours. So it is slightly a different game.
So Josh Hull, I mean, he is the big winner this week, because not only is he in that Test match squad, he's suddenly both in the T20 squad. So there are 3 T20 internationals at the end of the year and 5 ODIs, I think, against Australia. And he's in both of those as well. Some interesting names. I mean, the uncapped players in the T20 squad, a squad from which some of the Test players are not playing, because that's coming right on the back of the Test series. Jacob Bethell from Warwickshire, Dan Mosley from Warwickshire, 2 bright young players in the middle order there, bat mainly, but bowl a bit as well. Josh Hull, as we mentioned, John Turner, Jordan Cox, they're all the uncapped ones, but Saqib Mahmood is back as well. And then Bethell, Hull and Turner are all in the ODI squad. And I suppose the big omissions, the 2 names that are missed out and a sign that England are moving on to a new era of white ball cricket, are Johnny Bairstow and Moeen Ali. And it looks like they're kind of moving on from those 2 and from a golden era, Nas.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a golden era, definitely. 50 over champions, 20 over champions, but both of those have gone. Not particularly impressive campaigns in both of those formats. It's an interesting point, actually, because they moved on from the coach. They moved on from Andrew Flintoff for now. but they've not moved on from the captain. So the next big tournament after Australia and a few one days here and there is going to be the Champions Trophy. So I reckon the selection panel is rightly, 100% rightly, looking for the future and looking to move on and looking long-term planning. But you've got a captain that absolutely needs to win and put in a really good performance in that Champions Trophy, because you can have a bad World Cup and a bad T20 World Cup, but then you lose your coach, and then the responsibility falls on you, as we all know. So you'd think the captain needs a good few months ahead. But they've stuck true to their word again, Af.
Yeah, I was just checking one thing in the ODI squad, because I was just checking to make sure I was right. Jamie Smith is in the ODI squad. He's played before. He's not a new cap. I just wondered whether he'll keep or not. It's an interesting one for Josh Butler, isn't it? Whether Jamie Smith keeps and Josh captains and bats in the ODI squad. There's a potential.
I saw Steve James, your mate at the Times, write that. I think that would be the way to go. It depends again what Josh wants to do, but again, Josh's main attribute to a side is his batting. Whatever makes him get the most amount of runs in either of those white ball formats. The coach and the selection, I know Marcus is going to be interim coach with that. He's going to do that Australia. I think the selection of coach is going to be so important. I think, we've spoken about it on this podcast. Bayliss worked with Morgan. Bayliss was behind the scenes and worked fine. But I think with Josh, you need someone a little bit more, or Josh needs to step up. One or the other. You can't have two sort of quiet, low key is an exaggeration, because we don't see what happens behind the dressing room. But you're going to need someone a bit more upfront in the coaching department, or Josh himself does a bit of that. But I like the selections because they've been true to their word. They can't do it one in red ball cricket and then in white ball cricket. There's no anomalies there. They believe in pace, so they've got pace. They've got Archer, they've got Mahmood, they've gone Bryden Cast, who's back from his ban or whatever. They've got Hull. They've gone with those John Turner. He's got a yard of pace as well. So you can see Sam Curran's back in as that all-rounder in T20, and he's a fabulous T20 all-rounder. There's not many there you can look at and go, well, what have they picked him? I saw Bethel and Mosley in the 100. They look fabulous players. Mosley's form fell off a little bit, but both good all-rounders, spin bowling all-rounders. With the amount of cricket that's going to be played in the subcontinent, I think that's important. So
I guess once upon a time, Jacob Bethel might have been playing for the West Indies. I mean, he born in Barbados, grew up in Barbados. I suppose that's one of the consequences of the imbalance of financial resources that we've talked about on the podcast before. That if you're looking at your career options, the two factors, I suppose, one is the kind of full-on professional structure in England that has allowed Jacob Bethel he came over for schooling and has joined the Warwickshire staff. But obviously, if you're looking at earning potential as well, it would be higher in England. But he's a very talented young player who I've seen a lot of.
Talking of Asians, no Chris Jordan. You mentioned senior players. They've moved on from. CJ, who got that hat trick on his home ground in Barbados. So this is a new look squad. I mean, Bethel well. We saw him in that England under-19 World Cup. Your lad goes drinking with him occasionally in Barbados. I interviewed him in the 100 actually, and he's 20, and he came across as a very mature 20-year-old. He looks a really good player, doesn't he?
He's super talented. Right from knee high on Accra Beach, you could see a little kid there that just had fantastic, hand-eye coordination. I mean, he's got it to do, hasn't he? It's another selection where, you don't look at the numbers and think he's been tearing it up in county cricket or in the 100, but you look at the potential, and I think it's pretty clear to everybody that there's a lot of potential there. And Dan Mosley would be in that same boat as well. I guess one person who might not be happy with the squads is the CFO, the Chief Financial Officer of the ECB. I was looking at the contract list, and Milan, Ollie Robinson, Ryan Ahmed, Jimmy Anderson, Ben Folkes, Jack Leach, Johnny Bairstow, Moeen Ali. There's a bit of money on the sidelines there, Nas.
What is the answer? Because obviously Rob Key has to plan and give long-term contracts.
It's a very interesting question. We might tackle it more in depth on another podcast. But they made the change to go to 2-year and 3-year contracts, not many 3-year contracts, but quite a lot of 2-year contracts, because of the threat of the franchised leagues. But I suppose the problem in professional sport is that things change quickly. Performances go up and down, and you want to keep the flexibility in selection. So they're certainly not selecting on the basis of who's got a contract. They're trying to select on the basis of what they think the best side is. But it means that some of those on contracts, Johnny Best, those on a 2-year contract, some of those are not playing. My own view is I'm not sure multi-year contracts work necessarily in a fast-moving sport where you got to keep people on their toes. But I'm prepared to listen to the other argument and might prepare to concede I might be wrong on that.
Yeah, it's not Key's money, so he's just finding it out.
What about selection more generally then? I touched on that, Archie McLaren quote at the start as a classic. Look what they've sent me. And for 100 years, really, and certainly when we were involved, there was a very similar process to selecting England teams. The captain was co-opted onto the selection panel. You had a kind of a chief selector, national selector, whatever you want to call him, chairman of selectors, who was often a big hitting former England player, whether it be Alec Bedser or Peter May or Ray Illingworth in my time, followed by some 2 or 3 other selectors and then a network of scouts. And that really was unchanged for 100 years. And the only thing that changed there was the level of input the captain got. Sometimes it was greater than at other times. I'll just give you an example from my period. When I took over as England captain, I was very much told by the people in charge then, we want to reassert the authority of the captain. So I was given a big say in that team that went to the Caribbean in '94. It was essentially the team I wanted. And then within 6 months, they'd appointed Ray Illingworth as a kind of overall supremo who demanded the final say when it came to selection. So that things changed very quickly for me in my first 6 months as captain. In Australia, the captain has historically not been part of the selection panel, but has been asked for advice, behind closed doors, but not necessarily having a vote. Where do you stand on how much influence the captain should have on selection?
As much as possible. I don't think there is a worse feeling than going onto a cricket field with people that you don't want there or don't believe in and don't think should be there. I think if you make the call and you want that person and it goes wrong, then the buck stops with you, really. And it changed for me, and it does change. And this is where modern technology must be very useful. When I first started and was being captain, I was being asked about players I'd been playing with. So I don't know, the end of careers of maybe Dominic Cork or Phil Tufnell or whoever, and then introduction of Chris Gothick and Vaughan and these sort of guys. I was so much had been playing county cricket, I'd seen either ones they'd want to get rid of or ones they wanted to bring in. As I went through those 4 years I was England captain, more and more people started to come up that I hadn't seen. Chris Schofield is an example of that I just hadn't seen. So you'd have to go on recommendations. But I was very lucky in Jeff Miller. Whoever they recommended and whoever they put forward, Dusty would always say, whatever we do, you have to take the 11 that you want or the 13 that we selected has to be up to you. And that wasn't passing the buck. They would recommend, but I would still have to then go away and, like I say, pick up the phone and ring people who played at the counties and find out about the character of these individuals. So it got tougher for me in the end because there were people whose name, because you're playing all the time as England cricket captain, you're not seeing some of these names. So the other thing you got to be very careful. In my era, you always used to just pick the next cab off the rank. There's so many in the papers. We used to go through that. You'd lose a test match and then it would be, there'd be 4 names the next day, the 2 leading run getters, the 2 leading wicket takers. Someone would get 100 in county cricket. And it was so easy just to pick the next one. And that's where I love Duncan. Duncan had this long-term view on selection. And I use that word, again, he was stubborn. He didn't really want to know who's getting the most runs. He wanted more information than that. What character, what speed, what would they be like when they came in the dressing room? How would they play quick bowling? When he first saw Chris Adams in South Africa, that first tour, he was a bit concerned. He was going at it with hard hands. hitting hard at it and nick off. And that's exactly what Grizzly did on that trip. So I think long-term planning is important in selection, and a captain has to be part of that long-term planning.
I mean, it's interesting just to reflect on how it was. We'll talk about the technology they have at their fingertips in a moment, but we had no technology back then. So what used to happen was that championship games would go often Saturday, Monday, Tuesday. You'd have a Sunday league game on the Sunday, and the selectors would meet where the captain was playing his county cricket, because we all played every county game that you weren't involved in an England match, you were playing county cricket. So the selectors would turn up to where the captain was playing, and all you'd have really were the county averages. Remember, nothing was streamed. County cricket wasn't streamed in those days. So a selector just had it on chance. You'd send a selector or a scout to watch, say, Graham Hick or Kevin Peterson or whoever it was. And, they might turn up and that player might not bat that day. Just look at the draw. So when I say it was an amateurish process, I don't mean that kind of critically. It was just how the time was, the lack of communication. I don't even think we had mobile phones when I started as England captain. And the lack of, county cricket being streamed or filmed meant that, you didn't have that much detail about players other than the county averages, which, as we talked about earlier with Josh Hull and others, can be very misleading. So I think, a funny story, my very first selection meeting, Ted Dexter turned up on his motorbike in his leathers. I mean, he was a really dashing figure. He was incredibly dashing. And we were in Southampton unlike me, playing at Hampshire. And he zoomed up on this Ducati or something, kind of got off, took his leathers off, brandishing the county averages. And then we proceeded to kind of sit around and chew the fat for an hour.
Was the Malcolm Devon story true or not? Is that a true story?
It is a true. He said that after a test match. But he's great. Ted was great, lovely, full of theories, and some of them, slightly more outlandish than others, but always thinking about the game. And of course, was a brilliant player. And that's often what happened. You had these Peter Mays, Alec Bedses, Ted Dexters, because they were significant names. And in fact, as you said, Jeff Miller was probably a selector who didn't play as much Test cricket. He played Test cricket for England, obviously, but seemed to me to be an excellent head selector. You don't need to be a big name. You don't need to have played 100 Test matches. But I do think you need a view from outside the dressing room. So Miller would have given that. And in the current setup, Luke Wright gives that, doesn't it? Because, Rob Key and Ben Stokes, Brendan McCullum, and then Joss Butler and Marcus Trescothick for the white ball squads, they're kind of in the dressing room environment. Strikes me that Luke Wright is a bit more detached. And I think a view from outside to challenge captains, coaches that can get a bit insular sometimes and be a bit too loyal, maybe. I think an outside voice is important.
Do you think you need to have a gut feel as well? I'll be perfectly honest. I have a poor gut feel for who's going to be a great cricketer. I mean, I was playing with, and I'll come on to who I think had a great feel. I was playing with Alistair Cook in a second team game. One of the many occasions I was England captain, out and nicked, playing in a second team game at Colchester, and I was batting with Cookie, and I got out walking around with Keith Fletcher, and I was talking to Keith about my batting. And Keith Fletcher went, "Don't worry about your batting. This lad here, he's going to play for England." And I saw this sort of tall, gangly, heavy-headed left-hander that couldn't, like as Mikey used to say, couldn't believe he got a run, really. And he ended up England's leading highest ever run getter. So, and that's Keith Fletcher. Definitely, he picked Thorpe on your Zimbabwe tour. He came back from that Zimbabwe tour. And I said, who did you rate in that Zimbabwe tour? And he went, obviously Atherton, played for England, good player. But there's that young lad, Thorpe. He is a serious player. And then Thorpe obviously had an eye for Root. He was raving about Root. Do you think you have that sort of gut feel? Knighty, I think Knighty's got a really good gut feel for players. He's been mentioning Bethel for the last 3 years, that Warwickshire connection. Morgan, Knighty was way ahead of the curve with Morgs.
Yeah, I think you want to have. They have a network of scouts, don't they? It's not just the selector that we talked about, Luke Wright, and then those with a formal vote, but they've got a network of scouts who go around the county county cricket scene, and their thing is multiplies multiple times. So they want as many scouts as possible to see the players that they like. So they get a multitude of views, not just one view, which can be, biased or whatever. You can form a view of players, and you might be slightly wrong-headed about that. So, and the other thing is just the technology now. I mean, as you mentioned, iHawk data. They've got speeds on every county cricketer. They've got data on how much revs a bowler spinner can put on the ball. Millions and millions of data points. Now, how you use that data, this combination about what you're talking about between gut feel, and data or science. I think when Ed Smith was interviewing for the job as the national selector, the question was, is it an art or is it a science? And it always has to be a combination of both. But I'm a firm believer that all this data must help. I mean, I would have loved to have had both the ability to watch cricketers on the streams and have all the data at your fingertips to make a more informed judgment. And I also think it's really important for the players. There's 400 or so county cricketers, men's county cricketers across the network. And, they're trying their hardest. It's their careers. It's their one chance. And they deserve a selection panel that is going to treat this as seriously and as thoroughly as possible to try and get the right outcomes. Now, there'll always be difference of opinions. We could sit in the pub and argue forever over who's the right call, who's the wrong call. Sometimes it will always be a matter of opinion, but the players deserve to know that the process is as thorough as possible. And it's unarguable that it's more thorough than certainly when we were captain.
Yeah, but the other thing you've got to, I will always throw in the ring, is that you got that character that we changed our mind. You've got to find out about the individual, whatever the data is telling you, doing it at one level. And that's why I like Jamie Smith, the character of Jamie Smith. I've been more impressed. Everyone's been talking about his batting. I've been actually how he's taken, Butch used it the other day, to the manner born or whatever. He just looks like he's been playing Test cricket for 5 years, not 5 weeks. He's just so composed, so calm. It's that sort of, when you're picking, ask people that have been in the dressing room with him, ask umpires, try and get as much information
And they will
about the
do that.
individual.
A lot of these players will have gone through the pathways. They will have been with England under 19s, the young Lions, and they will have been on the Lions trips, as Jamie Smith and others have. And they do build a kind of psychological profile of these players, which then, when the player gets put into the main team, that kind of dossier, if you like, is passed over then to the main coach, Brendan McCullum and Ben Stokes, so that they look at the information that has been built up on a player, a whole kind of rounded view, both of the player's cricketing abilities and also their character and what they're like around the dressing room, to try and make the transition into the England team as easy or as comfortable as possible. So I think it's miles better than it was.
If I could just throw in two more things. One, and I'm going back to my time, I've sat in selection meetings as England captain, and one of the very first ones, we went round the table, and all I heard about was what people couldn't do. Andrew Caddick doesn't get wickets in the first innings. Graham Thorpe, he averages 40. What else does he do? It's like, okay, he averages 40. That'll do for me. And also whether they're not, good blokes, not good blokes, whether they like a drink. This is not a little dig at this present regime, or whether they play golf or whatever. It's your job as a leader. If they are difficult, you look at Kevin Peterson, Ian Botham, Shane Warne. If they are slightly different characters, Brian Lara, whoever you might be, it's your job as a leader, as a management, to make sure you fit them in. It is a team game, but it's an individual game. So when I say pick on character, I also mean pick on difficult characters that will win you games. And it's your job to make those people buy into what you're trying to achieve.
And there will never be 100% success rate. I mean, we lauded, what they're doing at the moment. We've picked out all the good ouns that they've plucked from nowhere.
Have they got one wrong?
No, but what I mean is, though, that it's always, you're never 100% sure. As you can do all the thoroughness that we've talked about. You can pick on what you think is the right kind of person. You can pick on what you've seen and the potential there. and what makes it fascinating is that you just never quite know, because some players don't quite take to it. Some players don't. The extra pressure and scrutiny of an international setup. Some players don't take to it, and that will always be the case. That's what makes it. If selection was easy, if it was, if there were fail-safe methods, foolproof methods, you could just do it by algorithm, I suppose. You could have an AI national selector, but there'll always be that sense of uncertainty. There will always be opinions that differ. There will always be judgments to make, and that's what makes it fascinating. And they're doing a pretty good job right now.
Yeah. Talking of AI, I think women's side have been selecting of AI, haven't they, John Lewis? I think that's
tomorrow.
That's coming out later today or tomorrow, and we're going to touch on that Thursday at the Test match. Women's World T20 squad, imminent announcement, so we may have to touch on that as well.
Yeah, we're recording this on Monday. I think that announcement is coming Tuesday. We will gather again on Thursday. Nass is much more in his element down in the big smoke than he was up north, so he's looking forward to that. And we will reconvene on this podcast on the far side of the next test.